Madam Speaker, could I thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak? It is a maiden speech, but this is an important debate of substance, so I'll try to keep the formalities as far as maiden speeches to the minimum. I think that should be easy in my case, since I represent Twickenham, which I hope most people in the House have heard of, and doesn't therefore require me to make an extensive cook's tour of the constituency. I would like to say a few words briefly about my predecessor. Mr. Jessel served on the backbenches of the House for 27 years. It was never, I think, entirely clear to his constituents whether this was conscious career planning or merely the result of oversight by a succession of Conservative leaders. But whatever the reason, he applied himself very assiduously to the duties of constituency member, worked hard on their behalf, and many people have spoke warmly about the contribution he made in solving their individual problems. He also fought hard for particular constituency issues. Members of long standing will, I'm sure, remember the case of the Kneller Hall Royal Military School of Music, which he fought hard to serve. And there was a case, I think, in the 1980s when it was said that ministers and officials in the Ministry of Defence were spending more time worrying about the problem of military music than they were about the future of NATO, largely at his insistence. But he was successful in his campaign, and less officials in the ministry are relieved at his passing. I have to say that I will be fighting equally hard for that institution and others if they're threatened by the current government. But can I press on to the motion, which is an important one? I disagreed with almost everything that the member for Hackney and Stoke Newington said, but I think she deserves credit for having brought an important issue to the House, probably the most important decision that the government has yet made. And I've just briefly rehearsed what I think are the central arguments why central bank independence is important and why so many governments have gone down that road. I mean, the first is to have an institution which is very clearly and unambiguously committed to low and stable inflation. We take low inflation for granted, but I think we forget the corrosive effect of cumulatively high rates of inflation. If I can revert briefly to the game with the round ball rather than the oval one, I think if we think back to 1966 and German football supporters coming here for the World Cup, they required 12 Deutschmarks for every pound. Those who came back last year for the European Cup required less than 3, despite some appreciation of the pound in recent months. And that is a measure of the experience of monetary incontinence under governments of both major parties. It's a corrosive phenomenon. It's continually undermined the competitiveness of British industry and has required endless and often humiliating devaluations to recoup the loss of competitiveness. I've never understood myself why it is that people on the left feel that inflation is unimportant, because all the evidence suggests is that the main victims of inflation are the poor. The poor do not have the resources or the capacity to hedge against inflation. They don't have people to bargain on their behalf. They suffer more than anyone else. Now, this isn't just a British experience. The countries of South America, which have reverted from very high inflation to low inflation, like Argentina and Brazil, with the help of independent banks, have very high levels of inequality produced by inflation. There is now universal acceptance, not just in Europe, but in the Anglo-Saxon world, New Zealand, United States, South America, now in Russia, that you need a bulwark against inflation, and independent central banks provide that. And the reason why it's important not to have day-to-day political intervention is that it is actually difficult to do this politically. And the reason is that there are long lags in economic policy. It's necessary to raise interest rates long before inflation appears. And we know in practice that politicians can be courageous in making difficult decisions regarding monetary austerity. Lord Jenkins, Lord Healey in the past have forced through years of painful decisions in order to bring down inflation. But they always acted too late. And they acted too late because they should have acted, or their predecessors should have acted, in advance of inflation appearing. And that is what a technically based independent central bank can do. I mean, the second basic reason why independence is important is in relation to interest rates. I mean, we know from long experience that markets always discount inflation, and that long-term interest rates in Britain are consistently higher than those in other European countries, notably in Germany, and people pay a price for that. Companies pay a higher price in terms of a higher long-term capital. It's not just companies, but also individuals, and the national debt is inflated unnecessarily by high interest rates. And an independent central bank should get that down, as we saw from the market reaction to the Chancellor's announcement a few weeks ago. But the final point, and I think it is a very important one, is that we need to get it to a climate of long-termism in British industry. I see that the spokesman who will be speaking for the government on this issue this is an issue very close to her heart, and it's an important one. I came out of British industry from a company where we engaged in 25-year planning. I mean, industry is often very long-term in its outlook, but I was very fortunate that I was in a company, Shell, which had an extremely strong financial position with very little debt, and which is very internationally diversified, so you don't need to worry about exchange rate fluctuations. But if you're a British company, which is financially highly dependent on bank debt, if you're dependent on the value of sterling, you can be highly destabilized as a result of erratic monetary policy. And one of the reasons why British industry has been so short-term in its outlook is precisely because of the way monetary policy has been conducted. It's not in the nature of capitalism to be short-term. It's the way that our policy has been conducted. Now, there is a general problem with independent central banks, and I think this was the core of the member for Hackney's argument, which is a problem of accountability. I mean, how do you ensure democratic control over one of the core elements of economic policy? And it is a genuine dilemma, and different countries have struggled with this in different ways. The model, I think, the analogy that we could choose is with the military. I mean, clearly there has to be political control over the military, but no government in its right mind would imagine that battlefield commanders should be directed in their tactics in the field. We have to separate out broad political control with day-to-day management. And the model that the government has chosen, which is based on American experience rather than German experience, is absolutely correct and something we fully support. But having argued in favour of what the government are doing, both in terms of broad approach and in terms of the model they've chosen, I do wish to say that we on the Liberal Democrat benches are critical of some aspects of the way that the government have gone about this. I mean, one criticism relates to the process. There's been very little consultation. This has been sprung on the country, sprung on industry, sprung on the city. It could have been done in a much more thorough, consultative way. The member for Gordon sitting next to me, I think, demonstrated how this could be done. Some time ago, he prepared a statement of what a UK Reserve Bank could look like, discussed it with the city, discussed it with the Governor of the Bank of England, got feedback. And this is surely the process that the government should have followed. There is still time left when the legislation is considered, but it was done in a very peremptory way. Another criticism, I think, relates to the way in which the members of what is now called the Interim Monetary Committee are chosen. Now, the people who have been chosen are undoubtedly people of very, very high quality, and I think congratulations is due for the way in which, at least the quality of the people concerned. I can vouch for at least one of them, who was a predecessor of mine in Shell as chief economist, and is not only highly technically competent, but is also, to the best of my knowledge, politically very independent and is able to draw on the experience both of the United States and of British industry. And both and her and also Charles Goodhart, Willem Bouter are people of very, very high technical standards. But the way in which they were chosen could be improved. There is no reason, for example, why members of the Monetary Committee, as it will be, could not be interviewed by the Treasury Select Committee, as they would be in the United States. Their views exposed, their experiences examined, and approved by the House, adding to the democratic content of accountability. Another measure which could and probably should be taken is to extend their periods of office. At the present moment, they're vulnerable to political interference. Their contracts expire before this government's life probably will expire, and expanding their contracts to 5 or 6 years would give them the necessary security and political independence. And the other criticism I would make is something that is apparently trivial, but has important substance, which is its name. The fact that it's called the Bank of England, I think, sends the wrong signals. I mean, I spent the early part of my political career in Scotland, and I have some sensitivity to the fact that we are the United Kingdom. But it's not simply a reflection of sensitivity to Scottish feeling, but the fact is that we are a country of regions, and the regions differ. There is a very different level of house ownership in Scotland from in England. Levels of unemployment differ greatly from one part of the country to the other, and those regional experiences should be reflected in the makeup of the people who make decisions about monetary policy. So we would like a regionally based system of directors, as well as drawing on outside academic expertise. Just one final point in conclusion. I think we, on these benches, strongly support what the government has done, both in principle and in terms of the model they've chosen. But I think it's important to stress that this is a necessary rather than a sufficient condition for good economic policy. If the government were to allow the Bank of England to operate independently, to pursue an austere approach to the management of money, while not disciplining its fiscal policy, what we would very quickly find would be in a period of very high interest rates, appreciating sterling, and considerable damaging side effects. So one of the necessary corollaries of what it has done on the monetary front is to apply similarly discipline to its fiscal policy. And we shall see in a few weeks' time in the budget whether that commitment is indeed there. But thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence in allowing me to speak.
Mr. Stephen Timms.